All right. Thanks for joining us for our final panel. We've had really great conversations throughout the day. Thanks for being here. We went into a lot of doctrinal details, and Marty yelled at us, telling us we need to zoom out and really see the broader scale attack on the rule of law. And so this last panel is an opportunity to zoom out a little bit and talk less about some of the details and really see this as a larger threat to the rule of law. So I'm joined by both Marty and Melissa, who were in the earlier panel, and also now Francis Fukuyama, the legendary Stanford political scientist. He doesn't need an introduction, so I'll leave it in that. So we're going to start with Frank.
Okay, thank you very much, Diego. So as one of the few non-lawyers in the room, I thought I would focus on something slightly different. In the first of these meetings, Diego distinguished between three levels of abuses. So there's stuff that's unconstitutional, that's one. There's stuff that's illegal, that's two. And then there's stuff that's bad governance. And I want to focus on that third bucket because I actually think that listening to the earlier panels, it seems to me that you lawyers are disagreeing a lot on exactly where things fall in terms of the legality of certain measures. But I know bad governance when I see it. And I think that this is, one of the important themes that goes throughout a lot of the first 100 days. Many of the things that Trump has done are rooted in some actual problem. But the way that he's gone about trying to fix the problem just makes it worse to the point where you think that his goal is actually to, undermine government itself. So just to give you, a leading example, the old Schedule F, which is now apparently Schedule PC, policy career, that was tried at the end of the first Trump term. So there's a real problem in the civil service because it's probably the case that accumulated protections for civil servants are a little bit too strong. The MSPB has not been working for several years because of quorum problems and so forth. And so it would have been good to actually have removals made a little bit more flexible, but instead you create this entire new schedule where basically instead of having 4,000 to 5,000 Schedule Cs that turn over with every administration, now basically everybody down to your local postmaster is going to be able to flip over. And it's basically a return to the patronage system that existed before the Pendleton Act, when basically all federal employees were at-will employees. The problem, the governance problem with regard to that is obviously you're destroying the merit-based system, and you are opening the door to massive politicization of the civil service. I think if you think that actually this power of appointment is going to be used wisely, just consider several of the cabinet-level appointments that Trump made early on in his second term. If you think that you're not going to have a return to basically people whose primary qualification is slavish loyalty, personal loyalty to Trump. If you think about Elon Musk and Doge, again, it is the case that there are a lot of inefficiencies in the existing civil service. I've started a little working group to actually come up with what I think, or what we think would be a proper reform that would make the civil service more efficient. If you want to hear what that is, I'm happy to tell you after the session. But Doge is kind of the opposite of good policymaking. I think the kind of policymaking that we teach in public policy programs like mine is evidence-based, it's deliberative, it is transparent, it invites public participation, and the process that Doge has undertaken is the exact opposite. It's completely non-transparent. There does not seem to be any deliberation. You take a bunch of 20-something young engineers, you show them a list of budget lines, and they say, oh, that doesn't look useful to me, and you've X'd them out and fired the employees in question with actually no deliberative process, and as far as I can tell, no actual knowledge about what any of these employees does. And so you just think, with any organization, if you randomly fire 20% of the staff, is it going to function better? I really doubt it. And the intention behind this is really not good governance. I'll just give you one example of this, which is an organization that I've been very close to, the National Endowment for Democracy. It's a very small organization with it had about a $300 million budget. So actually cutting it is not going to fix the budget deficit problem. But early this year, they found that they simply could not get the money that had been appropriated by Congress to them out of the Treasury. Somebody was holding it up. They filed a lawsuit against the administration. A judge said that they had to turn the spigot on. And the administration has actually been very clever. They learned from some of the earlier reversals in courts. So they didn't turn the spigot back on. They did not give them the full amount that they were owed. They basically have to go to the Treasury every single week and ask for enough money to keep the organization running for that week. And they're told not to expect the full amount of the appropriation, so that, in a sense, they look like they're complying with the judge's order, but in fact, the intention is to destroy the organization. They've had to release about 70%, or furlough about 70% of their staff. They've been able to hire some of them back, but basically these organizations, are going to lose their continuity, and in effect, I don't think this organization is going to survive. Congress may take the entire money out of the next budget. We'll have to see about this. The problem, I think, with this approach is that Doge's theory is completely wrong. It begins with an assumption that there is a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse in the government, that it's overstaffed, that bureaucrats are lazy, incompetent. And I think empirically, the truth is actually the opposite of this. Is something that people don't realize, but the total number of FTEs in the civilian workforce today or before these cuts was about what it was in 1969. And the amount of money that's now cycled through the federal budget is about 5 times as much as it was in 1969. So in effect, there's actually been a great improvement, of money dispersed per federal employee. And I think that most of the experts in public administration actually think that the government is massively understaffed. John DiIulio actually wrote a book a couple years ago where he said we need to hire another 1 million federal workers, especially younger ones that have tech skills, in order to actually keep the government up to date in terms of things like artificial intelligence and so forth. The state capacity that is now going to be undercut as a result of these Doge firings is not, the need for that capacity isn't going to go away, and it's going to be met through one avenue, which is the dodge that's been practiced over the years before that, which is to use contractors. That's the way that the government can actually handle the workload that it has with a employment base that is constantly shrinking with respect to its responsibilities. So there's, a whole variety of reasons for thinking that reform is really not the objective of Elon Musk, of Donald Trump, or the administration. They simply want to destroy the existing capacity in the state. Something like the NED, they don't want to make it work better, they simply want to make it go away, and I think that that's really been the motive behind a lot of their efforts, and they've been very effective at it because they've discovered that once you turn off that liquidity spigot, the organization dies, whatever the legal status, and the courts are not going to get around for weeks or months to trying to turn it back on, and at that point, the functionality is gone. That's, I think, the problem with governance. It's not a matter of legal rights. It's really a matter of extremely bad practice. All of the things that we try to inculcate in people about how to make public policy are really being vitiated. Maybe we'll save this for the Q&A. I do think that what Bob and others were saying about the motives behind this are correct, that it's very personal. I've felt for a long time that the best way to explain the Trump administration was not in terms of economic motivations, not even in terms of the sociology of the people that support him. It's much more personal than that, and it really has to do with his personal psychology, because why go after like all these lawyers that have the most tangential relationship, to Jack Smith or any of the prosecutions? There's something, beyond that really, it may have to do with a demonstration of power. I think it has to do with a intense personal resentment that our president has felt towards this establishment from many, many years ago. And I think it also explains things like his policy towards Russia, because in his mind, the Russia hoax, the so-called Russia hoax, is one of the big drivers of and motivators for a lot of certainly his foreign policy and the like. All right, with that, I'll quit. Thank you.
Great. So either Marty or Melissa.
Melissa thought I could. So that's good. That wasn't bloodless at all. So we will. I thought I'd try to tie together a lot of the themes of the different panels, and give them some connective tissue. I agree with Frank. I agree with Bob that part of this is just personal, and his, the resentments and egomania of one particular person is driving a lot of this. But I think there's also one other very important theme or explanation for a great number of the things that are so troubling. And I'm glad that you mentioned, it's not so much the constitutional law or even law violations. And I'm not going to talk so much about threats to the rule of law as threats to the system of checks and balances writ large and in our traditional ways of governance, rather than the rules. Yes, we've talked a lot about how he might either be skirting the law or violating the law and the like, but to me that's interesting and important for us lawyers and law professors and the like, but not the most important thing altogether. What ties it all together for me is that at every turn, in so many different ways involving so many different actors, the president is taking actions to try to eliminate all of the laws and norms and structures and personnel who have been in place to keep the federal government acting in accordance with law and engaged in an internal and external debate and discussion about how best to govern the country, so as to basically concentrate not only all power, but all decision-making in one person at the head of the executive branch. Every check from civil society to those within the executive branch and the other two branches, all of the efforts are made to make sure that no one has the capability, wherewithal, or quite frankly, desire to do anything to challenge his view of the way things ought to be. And that's fundamentally inconsistent with the norms that developed over 100 years, going back to the Pendleton Act and before, about creating both legal and non-legal structures, norms, and rules that are meant to provide better government by distributing power, and even to the extent the power does reside in the president, creating procedures. And so many of the people in this room, Bob and I and others, and Pam, we've been through this, right? And to a certain extent, it's frustrating. And you see reports now from former Biden administration officials, in retrospect, so frustrated that they had to comply with the Administrative Procedure Act. And there were all these career people who were always like checking them and getting in the way, and they couldn't do things quickly. And in today's day and age, if you don't show results in 2 weeks, you're not going to win the next election. Those norms were put in place over time, and maybe they needed to be adjusted to fit the modern world and things moving so much faster and the like. But those norms are in place for a reason, and in part to prevent authoritarian capture and to make for better governance. So I'm just going to tick these off and see if you agree with me that in every case it's an effort to basically eliminate any avenue of any procedure for questioning, let alone challenging and debating what the leader wants to do. So starting outside the government, we've already talked about the way that higher education has been brought to heel. We haven't talked a lot about it, but we've mentioned it. And obviously, whatever the results of these lawsuits are, and higher ed's going to win these lawsuits, I think it is very, very clear that universities are going to be walking on eggshells and being much, much, much more cautious, with great harm to academic freedom and to the ordinary, traditional, critical functions of the university with respect to the government. Law firms, same thing. Right, the greatest challenge, and they too will win all these lawsuits, and they will still, as a whole, very few firms will be taking actions representing people who are challenging, bringing suits against the federal government and the Trump administration. That the fear that they will have that they will be persona non grata and lose clients and lose money and not be able to function will be there even after the legal victories are won. And so law firms will be less willing to challenge. The press, obviously his preferences for certain members of the press, his ability to basically cater to the major social networks at the beginning so that they're fawning over him in the front row at the inauguration and the like, is meant to manipulate the most powerful members and owners of the press in America to not be as critical of him as they have been in the past. And we've seen the results at the Washington Post and the LA Times and so many other outlets. Congress, right? It's not just that every Republican member of Congress agrees with everything Donald Trump says. It's that beginning with the vote on the second impeachment and continuing to this day, the Republican members of Congress are terrified about voting against him and rejecting something that he does, and for good reason. Because they are threatened with losing their jobs, and they would lose their jobs, and this has been coordinated by the president and his folks. And worse, they and their families are subjected to enormous pressure at best, and ridicule and constant doxing at best, if not implied threats to themselves. That is a concerted effort to keep Congress in line. And the same thing's happening with the courts. Right? It's not just non-compliance. It's that judges are now fearful, and judges' families are fearful because of what's going on. Those are all outside of the executive branch. Civil society, the other two branches, and the like, all of which are in the service of reducing or eliminating altogether any checks upon the presidency. Within the government, I'll start outward from the most important institution in America, the Office of Legal Counsel. It's been basically neutered, right? They don't go to the Office of Legal Counsel, which is the office that is designed intentionally to make sure that the executive branch complies with the law, right? And that actually, contrary to popular view, as those of us who have served at OLC before, says no on a daily basis to proposals from the president and from those in the executive branch, and helps them change their proposals so that they can comply with the law. This is a very complex process, and it's not just OLC. The litigating divisions within the Department of Justice, right? Proposed actions are raised with them in the first instance so they can say what will be problematic, what will be subject to serious litigation risks. Here's how you should do it instead. The career lawyers within the Department of Justice and outside it have been basically silenced. The new Attorney General on her first day in office puts out a memorandum basically telling all DOJ lawyers that they have to zealously represent everything. They can never even recuse from a case that they're morally or otherwise troubled by. It's the job of them to serve in the DOJ to zealously defend the interests of the United States. That sounds fine. But those interests of the United States are set by the nation's chief executive, vested by the Constitution with all executive power. Can you imagine an Attorney General of the United States saying that the nation's policy is set by the chief executive of the United States and not by Congress and by the Constitution? That's a remarkable statement. And we've seen that lawyers within the Justice Department, if they so much as say, I don't know what my client is doing, and I agree, Your Honor, that maybe you should do X, Y, and Z, and maybe we acted unlawfully, they are suspended or they are demoted from doing their jobs, right? So this makes lawyers much more reticent about doing the ordinary work that they do to make sure that the government complies with the law. DOJ as Pam was discussing, other lawyers, huge numbers of lawyers, huge percentage of DOJ and so many other agencies have voluntarily or under pressure left their jobs. So they were no longer being able to perform the checks and the functions that they had devoted their careers to doing, and they have simply left the department. There are not the people there to check. Most of the IGs were removed. Now that's perfectly lawful, but obviously it was done to make sure that there's no investigations of the compliance with the government with the law, right? The civil service has been decimated. The Merit Systems Protection Board we discussed in the first panel. Those who are there to make sure that the civil service is treated fairly and that the administration complies with the law in disciplining or firing the civil service. He's removing Democratic members of that board so that it can't perform its functions. He fired the special counsel who had statutory tenure protection so that the Hatch Act and whistleblowers are not protected either under that law. The independent agencies, he puts out an executive order saying that under the unitary executive theory, he is in control of them as well. And for the first time, they have to go to OMB with all of their proposed rulemaking to make sure that it clears OMB basically approval, although the executive order doesn't quite say that. It gives the White House extraordinary power over all of the so-called independent agencies, with the exception, Aditya, of the Federal Reserve, and only as to monetary policy as to the Federal Reserve, which he carved out as a special exception so as not to upset the markets too much. That's an extraordinary thing. 2 weeks ago, he issued the most important executive order at all, right? The one that stopped the war on water pressure. I'm sure you guys all read about that one, right? The Biden-Obama war on water pressure. This is the end. We are making America's water pressure great again. These are quotes, okay? And he's doing that by instructing the relevant government head of department to get rid of a definition of showerhead that results in various limitations on how showerheads can be manufactured and sold in America. And he says that they don't have to go through notice and comment in order to do it, don't need to comply with the Administrative Procedure Act. Why? Because I've already decided what the rule's going to be, so you have to follow what I say, so what use is notice and comment? I'm not subject to the Administrative Procedure Act as a matter of statute. I don't have to follow notice and comment. It would be a waste of time for you to do so as well. There's other examples as well that you could tick off, but I do think that the through line, the thread that really connects all of these, is an effort to concentrate not only power, but decision-making in one person, and to get rid of all of the checks, checks and balances, but more importantly, deliberation within the executive branch, within civil society, within the other two branches, in order to give the president this overweening power. And I do want to point out that I do think that the Supreme Court is partially responsible for this. So the decision in Saylor Law and similar cases in which the Chief Justice, even putting aside the immunity case, in which the Chief Justice rules that under our Constitution, the executive power, all of it, is vested in a president, that everyone else in the executive branch, all of them, are there to assist him in carrying out his duties to administer statutes, and that those who wield executive power do so on his behalf, is taken to its extreme, would be a radical transformation of historical understandings for over 200 years. It would mean the president can himself or herself enforce all the laws, administer all the laws, direct all agency officials to exercise their statutory discretion in any way that he sees fit, overrule all of their decisions, and ultimately remove all of them. I don't know that Aditya believes in that extreme form of the unitary executive theory, but it does come out of this rationale that John Roberts articulated, and Donald Trump is taking it to its extreme, right? He's taking that language and exploiting it in all of these ways on the theory that it's all him, it's all one decision maker. I don't want anyone questioning what I do. So I'll close with just making you even more fearful in one respect. I think that the ultimate test is going to be if and when, and I think it's more likely than not, there's an effort for Donald Trump to run for a third term. okay? And when I say this to my constitutional law 1 class, they kind of looked at me and chuckled. And, you know, when they were making all these noises about it and he was being asked about it, he's like, I don't know, the lawyers are telling me it's possible, but it's a long way off, I'll decide then, and that sort of thing. And my common law 1 students are saying, this is ridiculous. Obviously, the Constitution limits you to 2 terms. And you go through it with them, and you show them, we don't have time to do it here unless you guys are gluttons for punishment, how you might look at the various language. The president can't be elected for a 3rd term, but there's nothing in the Constitution that technically says he or she cannot serve a 3rd term and cannot be on the ballot for a 3rd term. And so then the question is, what if enough states what if the Republican Party nominates Donald Trump for a 3rd term, enough states put him on the ballot for a 3rd term, he gets popular majorities of over 269 electors on those ballots. Those electors who arguably should not cast their votes for him if they want to comply with the Constitution will do so, and it will get to Congress, and Congress, at least one house of Congress is controlled by the Republican Party. Where in that process does the Supreme Court step in to say no? In other words, even if you think it's a preposterous idea that the president could serve a 3rd term, what is the mechanism that is in place that would say no? Now, the answer used to be, we had all these norms in place. We had all these institutions that were set up in which people would, as they did after Watergate, when most of, or a good portion of the Republican Party said, of course Richard Nixon is not qualified to be president anymore. That is gone. And it's gone largely because of Donald Trump and the folks around him. So I don't know that that will happen. I hope it doesn't, and I hope I do have theories about how you could get some of that into court in ways that might be plausible, but you shouldn't dismiss it cavalierly when you hear wind of it. So there, I hope I've depressed all of you sufficiently today. And I'll turn it over to Melissa.
Very depressed. All right, so because my personality would not allow me to stay with the depression, I have to find something, more, I guess, positive.
You're wearing a scarf.
Or I am, that's my job. So, I think that I will just draw on a few lessons from, folks I've worked with overseas, and I know a number of other folks here have a lot of interaction with activists overseas. But as I've been talking to them recently, they are continually asking me, why are Americans not in the streets? What is up, Americans? And so I will just say that people are looking at the U.S. and are looking for some leadership from our society. So one lesson that I would draw is, I would say, from my Russian colleagues, and that is, don't act like this is normal, because it's not normal. And so that means, I think for us, especially as lawyers, that we need to perhaps get a little creative with the way we think of ourselves and our identities. And perhaps, we're thinking about creative lawyering. I love the thinking about the 23B2 class action. I've thought about whether agencies could band together as well, because we've been talking about that. But I think it also means that as lawyers, we are perceived as leaders in our communities. We can be educating those around us about what constitutionalism is, what checks and balances are, just in conversations, but also in community groups. There's recent research that counters the idea that this concept of rule of law, we all think, oh, this is very technical, people don't understand it. Research is showing that right now, people get it. That rule of law is something that they understand, and that we shouldn't shy away from using the term rule of law. I was very affected yesterday to be part of one of the Law Day events where lawyers retook their oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States as officers of the court. And to do that in a place with thousands of other lawyers, I would say is very moving, but it also communicated to me that is part of our role. I also think we can learn a lesson from Trump, And that is, something that has been raised in various ways today. Trump knows the value of a signal or of a symbolic message. And I think we can get better at thinking about symbols of freedom, of constitutionalism, ways of communicating messages that aren't full of verbiage and, technical, but, get better about having a concrete, tough message about rule of law. And learn from that pithiness and also maybe from the humor. A third lesson that has come up today is to, we have this need for courage and a need for bravery. We can create that. We can create courage and create bravery. That comes, of course, from small acts, from, this doesn't need to be a major action on behalf of all of the DOJ. But, there are small actions that I think individual members of agencies or, civil servants are happening that are, I think, meant to create some momentum. I will just mention that in a number of the agency cases that I've been tracking, the judges are saying things like, this argument was totally coherent. These, the government's lawyers made no sense. I just personally wonder if there's just a little bit of maybe those lawyers not feeling the argument enough to be able to make the argument look coherent. Never mind that the actions, the legal actions that are taking are really coherent. I also, on the subject of bravery, I'll note, I think I mentioned earlier today Polish judges, and I would guess that a number of people here have heard the story of Polish judges, but I think what was remarkable about the attacks on those judges and what they did and how they responded is that they saw themselves as part of the community. And they began to step outside of their robes and do little teach-ins about the Constitution. Or, they actually toured. Some of the judges that were disciplined did a tour de Constitucia, and they talked about the Constitution. And when it came down to the judges being kicked out of their courtrooms, they led a march to their courtroom, the March of 1,000 Robes. And so they acknowledged that they were part of a civil society in a way that encouraged and resulted in the public joining them and seeing them as symbols. I suppose maybe I will stop there. There are, a few other lessons and suggestions that I've been hearing. Collective action does come up a lot, but I think that starts with a few steps and doing outreach, just outside of your comfort zone. So I'll stop there.
Diego, do you mind if I ask Melissa and Frank sort of a provocation? So there was a gentleman here, a couple from France, saying, why aren't you in the streets out there for the rule of law or for procedural regularity or governance as we have known it for over 100 years, or the civil service? And you see that in some European nations. In Israel, obviously, hundreds of thousands were coming out just because the Netanyahu government had tried to make, fairly minor, discrete inroads into the independence of the civil service and the judiciary there. And the entire culture saw that as a profound threat. And here that doesn't generally resonate, right? You need to tie it to something substantive that people don't like. So I wonder whether rule of law, procedure, and my friends tease me because I'm the ultimate proceduralist, right? Procedural regularity, APA, that's not going to get people out in the streets. However, I was really struck and surprised that the Abreu Garcia case.
All right, so this is exactly what I was going to talk about, but you took it away from me.
Mind meld
Well,
there, Diego.
No, this is great. Part of what I wanted to say is that the rule of law, I think, as a phrase, doesn't. It rings hollow to Americans because we don't have a recent history of authoritarianism. So if you talk to Eastern European judges, if you talk to Latin American judges, they've all had to develop an explicit sense of this concept, and they teach it to judges, and they teach it to law students, and they all link it to, well, when we had a dictatorship in the 80s, look, this is why we didn't have the rule of law. The fact that a dictator can just throw you into a kangaroo court and put you in prison, or even worse, tossed out of a helicopter, right? On the other hand, I think due process rings to Americans, and it has always rang to Americans. Some of the most contentious debates at the founding were about procedure. Patrick Henry was complaining about arrest without warrants or a jury of one's peers. Due process has been at the heart of American complaints about the exercise of power forever. And I do think the deportation cases touch that. I think Americans do understand due process. I think what you have to teach them is that due process is foundational to the rule of law. But I don't think the phrase rule of law is one that resonates with Americans.
So I was at the University of Oregon yesterday on a panel with my colleague Larry Diamond talking about democracy and equality and other good things. And the undergraduate student union was locked in a big fight with the university administration. And so about 70 demonstrators came into our panel, a room like this, and were waving signs and shouting and yelling. And it struck me that, I have not seen any student groups in the United States actually get up and shout about the stuff that their administration in Washington is doing. I mean, I can see why, they might be unhappy about the minimum wage they're getting and this sort of thing, but there's a huge collective action problem, I think, in terms of public protest. In Israel, the reason that you got it was very specifically, this one bill that would have neutered the Israeli Supreme Court that was a focal point for those national demonstrations. I think in Poland, it was actually the abortion issue that really catalyzed people. And I don't think that there's a single abuse. I mean, the trouble is, you have a panel like this and you catalog 50 different abuses. And I don't think that there's been a good focal point that touches enough of the different groups in a very complex, diverse, big society like the United States that can act as a trigger for this sort of thing.
I mean, you mentioned the Israel case. You're right. It was Netanyahu trying to get rid of the Supreme Court of Israel's ability to review executive actions for reasonableness. And they got 200,000 people out on the street. I'm like, if I said, I'm holding a rally tomorrow night for hard look review, I couldn't get my family out on the street, okay? It's like, but part of this is fatigue. Remember, students and women were out in huge numbers during the beginning of the first Trump administration. I think this last election chastened a lot of people, shocked a lot of people. There's Trump fatigue, and there's this sense that at best we are a 50-50 nation, and the problem isn't just the government, but that our message doesn't it gets through to all of us collectively within our information bubbles, but a good half of the nation just is seeing things in fundamentally different ways. And I think I think that was a really chastening moment. And that's partly why people haven't been out on the streets. Who's the audience for it? How do we reach the other 50%?
Friend from France wanted to bring a comparative perspective from Europe.
Yeah, no, just to bounce back on this, I mean, from the view from Europe and the rest of the world, everyone is really fixated on what's happening in America. And the United States not only stood for the rule of law and constitutionalism, but really taught the rest of the world about the rule of law and seeing what's happening here is simply unbelievable. And we're still wondering, you're talking about the debate about whether the courts should remain more technical and so on. And, we don't see it that way. We think, with everything that's happening, there's a need for more boulders. And the Israeli Supreme Court, at the end, decided, no, you cannot diminish our own power. They were bold enough to do that. And so, really the reaction worldwide, and certainly in Europe, is, first of all, we are amazed that it could happen in the first place, but we're amazed that there's so little being done, both on the streets and on the courts and everywhere else, with what's happening. I mean, that's a reaction from the outside.
I want to explore the possibility of the improbable. We've been talking about a stasis that we can't seem to get out of because we don't have the institutional mechanisms to do so. But just think about public opinion for a moment. Now, in Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, where 89% of the population wants to join the EU, they can't because of one scallywag, a Russian oligarch. So Trump's popularity within recent times, Siena poll is 42%. Say that drops to 32%. I think he's got 32% of this country as true believers, and they'll, like lemmings, go over the cliff with him. But what if it drops to 32% and Republicans are saying, he's just not as powerful as he used to be. We might be able to win this even if we don't kiss his ring. Do you see a possibility there? Because I see two things. I see a public opinion or a major crisis that we can't imagine yet.
Well, maybe, Marty, can you talk about this temporizing idea that the Supreme Court is delaying until government is weaker?
I heard this. It may have even been on Bob and Jack Goldsmith's little videos or one of those. The idea that Roberts is not only trying to get a unanimous court for some of these decisions and trying to be, temperate in tone so as to preserve the court's authority, but might also be engaged in a delaying mechanism, like wanting to push down as far as possible to a point where it's not the first 10 weeks. We want to know what the nation's going to think about Trump. Maybe he won't have that kind of support and the like. Sure, I mean, the House might turn over in 2 years. The Senate structurally is going to be, unless the Democratic Party changes quite considerably the sorts of candidates it starts putting up, getting 50 or more votes in the Senate is a real challenge. But let's say we did, and I was going to save this for the very end and just ask you guys what you think. The next time a Democrat becomes president, they're not going to run on procedural regularity and let's go back to Biden-Garland kind of norms. I don't know what it's going to look like, but it's not going to be rule of law, or Administrative Procedure Act, or bring back the civil service. That's not going to be what they run on, and it's not going to be the way they want to move, given political and media realities these days. Folks are going to want to get things done in the first 6 months, not just propose a rule that's subject to a 3-year notice and comment process that you get done the week before you lose power again and it gets repealed, it gets removed in 2 weeks. I don't know what that will look like, and I'm a little bit concerned myself about whether this is something more fundamental. But
so I think that there is a $100 bill lying on the sidewalk that could be picked up by a Democratic politician or, by a coalition, a bipartisan coalition of people opposed to Trump. And that's the one that's outlined in Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book, Abundance, because they say very clear, and there's actually been a number of, Mark Dunkelman has another book called Why Nothing Gets Done that makes a very similar point, that people on the left, progressives, want government to do things in a positive direction, but they burden the government with so many procedural rules that it can't actually accomplish anything. And, Klein gives lots of examples of this, like why is there a housing crisis in California? Very simple. There are not enough affordable houses. It is very, very difficult to build a multifamily housing structure in Palo Alto or anywhere else in the state because of the burden of these rules. And so if you accept the premise that we actually need to build things and we need to dramatically streamline a lot of the permitting rules that are keeping us from doing things like building transmission lines. Texas and Oklahoma are the biggest producers of alternative energy. It takes almost 10 years to get a transmission line approved through our current system, through NEPA and the various rules that stand in the way of doing that. And if a Democratic politician actually said, yes, we want a future in which we've got clean, abundant clean energy, we know how to produce it, and here's a formula for actually getting it done and implementing some of this, then I think that is not simply criticizing Trump. It's not abstractly saying rule of law, APA, and so forth. It is saying, we want clean energy. We want affordable housing in California.
But doing it, if the progressive side has the White House, doing it will run into a Supreme Court that will be pushing all of these procedural norms. So one thing that we haven't talked about today is tariffs. And there's now lawsuits challenging on the major questions doctrine, among other things, Trump's tariffs. If the Supreme Court allows Trump to do those things and doesn't apply the major questions doctrine, the Democrats will have no appetite for not being just as aggressive. But I have a feeling that as long as this Supreme Court majority is in place, they're going to make it extremely difficult, Frank, for the federal government to do what you're saying. But I do think you're invoking state government is very important. It may be that that's really where the generative ideas and policies have to start emerging.
That's what I was going to say. The abundance agenda, a lot of it is targeted at state governments like California. And federal, you need statutory changes to NEPA. So I'm also heavily supportive of that. We have a question up here.
Well, I have one comment, which is I'm really amazed this is May 2nd, and there was, I think, a huge May Day turnout on the streets. I mean, I was part of it in San Francisco and many different cities. I mean, it was even on the PBS NewsHour. It was covered. So nobody's recognizing that. And it was even bigger in the hands-off demonstrations on April 5th. I mean, so there was turnout, despite the fear and intimidation and learned helplessness that I think a lot of people have gotten, as you said, with all the Trump machinations, especially students. I think students got intimidated and sort of, as a psychologist, I call it learned helplessness because they were afraid. But what I found really interesting is that a lot of the people that were demonstrating were older people who had a lot of results from demonstrating in the 60s. And over time, and as these, I really think these groundswell movements are increasing. They're not talking about rule of law, but there are signs about due process. There are signs about, no oligarchy. That's a hard word to say, but the idea is no kings. We need democracy. And I do think over time, as these I forget how someone put it, but as the measures that Trump takes gets worse and worse, more and more people will get out there and their agency will show.
Thank you.
Melissa was going to respond.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, like that, I think that's true that there have been protests in the streets. They haven't been as big as the last administration, and they're not as coordinated. I do think, though, that one lesson is that the Tesla protests have gotten a lot of traction, and they've been regularized and kind of normalized. And so, I do think that's a lesson that I would pick up from other movements, is that corruption is something that motivates people, and especially over time. I think that hammering on corruption and especially the lawlessness and self-dealing that's occurring in this administration will be part of its downfall.
I wanted to share a thought and see what the panel thinks, especially as we have Francis on the panel. We've talked about how the checks and balances are being undermined and power and decision-making is being concentrated. And it seemed to me for a while that we're heading in a direction of reforming America to look a lot like China. It seems kind of ironic that 20 years ago we brought China into the global trading system and we thought the result would be that trade and integration would make China more like America. And I look at it today and it feels like we're trying to embrace a Chinese system where there's a pseudo rule of law, but you can kind of have the rug pulled out from under you at any moment. I would wonder what the panel thinks to that as a kind of analogy to where we are. And similarly to that, actually discussing that with some other attendees at lunch, and somebody remarked that maybe we need our Tiananmen moment. Because it feels like some of the comments the panels throughout the day have made is to say, we're dealing with this form of kind of not civil disobedience, but administrative disobedience, where the government just refuses to follow rulings of the courts. And ultimately, when contempt is found and election rules aren't adhered to, we seem to be getting a message that says it requires citizens to be in the streets, potentially confronting one group, Marty, that you didn't list that has been purged, which is the military.
Yeah, military is complex. This is definitely a question for Melissa and Frank, that comparative. I will say this about our Tiananmen moment, and I know, and it's not comparable to Tiananmen Square, but Pam reminded me this morning that June 14th this year happens to be both Flag Day, right, June 14th, and Donald Trump's 79th birthday. And as soon as she told me that, I looked online, and the military is apparently planning a military parade to celebrate the Commander-in-Chief's birthday and the 250th anniversary of the Army. Maybe that's the moment for the Tiananmen. I'm not recommending anyone standing in front of the tanks, but
I don't think that's a good analogy. It's not analogous to China. It's analogous to Latin American authoritarian regimes. It's personalistic. It is heavily laced with corruption. It is not institutional. I mean, the most defining feature of the CCP, it's how institutionalized it is. It's not what we're talking about here. So I don't think that's a good analogy.
Oh, yeah, okay.
No, go.
Oh, I just quickly want to thank you for this panel and the whole day. I've been an attorney for almost 20 years, and a civil rights attorney, nonprofit attorney. And I've done class actions in civil rights, and we won cases and got great opinions, and then sometimes no one knew that case ever happened because the attorneys I worked with, fabulous people, didn't have media training, couldn't signal and be pithy, though they were brilliant. And so I'm wondering, to your point, I think Donald Trump actually learned his approach from The Apprentice. He learned it from the entertainment industry to be salient and pithy and symbolic and catchy. And so I guess I'm wondering, for this room of brilliant people and professors and leaders, like, how can we cut through the noise and start getting in front of people and waking up and getting into the streets? Like, I'm literally curious as an attorney and civil rights advocate, like, how do we get above the fray? And I wonder if you have ideas on how brilliant attorneys can make their information more digestible to the populace, to the 50% that, you know, we're trying to convince that chastised us in this last election. How do we cut through?
I'll offer a few thoughts. I think by talking to those people that we want to reach, and so learning from them a bit about how they see the world, but then also, yeah, I'm a lawyer, so I'm terrible at that too. So that means, you know, we have to have other people working with us. And I know for nonprofits that's sometimes difficult, but really having people with media savvy or, you know, looking for pro bono assistance, having younger people working with us, really important. That's that cross-sector networking, really important.
Sorry, just a quick response to your question from the audience. One thing I learned recently in sort of a collection of alumni from my own law school that is trying to do exactly what you're doing with a lot of the key organizations that would be in this space is the number of different organizations tracking each and every case that has been brought against the administration. And just to give you a few names in case it's useful for the group, New York Times, Just Security, Lawfare, Free Law, Court Watch, Immigration Policy Tracking, Civil Rights Litigation Clearinghouse, all of these resources I found useful in being able to kind of see the full picture. I know that that's not a substitute for organizations working together, but it's a start.
I don't want to prolong things. Just a quick question for response. I heard what you said about, Marty, I think you said it, I'm the president, everything comes through me, whatever. Of course, a deep problem we have in this country is expectation of presidential authority and, frankly, ability to work miracles, the promises presidents make, the promises presidents expect to make, the way that leads to public frustration and allegation of institutional failure is a huge issue. It's not as if Democratic presidents and other Republican presidents have come into office with sweeping claims about the problems that they were going to solve, what it meant for them to come into office. And the public looks to them to do that. There's a wonderful book by Gene Healy of the Cato Institute called The Cult of the Presidency. And he just documents this cultist focus, as long as people are not completely disillusioned in a particular presidency, on what a president can do. And this is a huge problem. I just mentioned it also because the aggregation of presidential power, though what Donald Trump is doing is in a world of its own, is something that both parties have embraced for decades. I mean, do you have a response to that?
No. No, I mean, I think that's right. Obviously, our system is set up to not allow one person to just snap her fingers and implement her campaign promises. Although he's doing a lot of what he promised to do by doing it without going through all of those processes. We have all of these institutional checks and balances. The fact that the legislature is not representative of the people, the fact that the court has not been controlled by presidents that have won popular elections for most of my lifetime. It's very, very difficult, and maybe that's a good thing, right? Because it means most of the time presidents can't act as autocrats. But now we're seeing one. If you want to destroy things, if you want to incapacitate government, it's very easy to do in 100 days. We've just seen it happen. It's much, much harder to build something.
Maybe just to wrap up, I want to explain how I think about political systems comparatively in terms of checks and balances. So in my mind, there is a spectrum of institutional design from fully authoritarian to fully democratic. And I have a couple of mythical countries that occupy each of those endpoints. China is at one end, where you have a pretty fully authoritarian system and you've got one veto point, which is Xi Jinping, or the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. The other end of the spectrum, in my imagination, is the state of California, where you have this law, the California Environmental Quality Act, that gives standing to all 40 million residents of California that can sue any project, public or private, no statute of limitations. They can sue anonymously, which in a certain way provides 40 million potential veto points, right? And every other political system in the world can be arrayed somewhere along this spectrum in terms of how many veto points there are, veto point being simply a political scientist's word for a check and balance, right? And if you look at the democratic world, we are also at the extreme end of the number of veto points. Most European parliamentary systems don't have as many as we do. We have a powerful upper house that can that's required for legislation. We have federalism to multiple levels of government. We have a court that can invalidate legislation, on and on. Other European democracies don't have as many veto points, and I think that, in my mind, part of the reason that you're getting this populist reaction is that we're so mired over at the California end of decision-making that it just leads people to snap and say, God damn it, we need somebody that can just cut through all this stuff and get stuff done. That's also the appeal of Elon Musk, right? Just fire everybody and, make decisions the way he did at Twitter. And I think that that's kind of the disease that we're trapped in. It's this, between these two extremes, we need to end up somewhere closer to the European end of that spectrum, reduce the number of veto points so that we can actually make collective decisions and do things like build transmission lines. You don't have to go all the way to China to get there, but China is a powerful attractor because in the developing world, people see that they can put up, like a COVID hospital in a weekend, and we cannot do that. World Bank and other institutions influenced by us can't do that sort of thing. And so that's my kind of comparative political scientist view about checks and balances, right? That there is this spectrum internationally, and we are too close to one of the poles of that, and that's what's producing people like Trump and Musk because they don't like being at that stuck end.
All right, and with that, I want to thank the panelists and thank you all for coming today.
And thanks to Diego and the others for putting this together. It's really wonderful.